Most of the time they disappeared from the story altogether by being categorized as homogeneous interest groups or monolithic institutions. I only accidentally worked at the World Bank for some time, yet used it as a perfect scenario for what people would call, what academics would call, participatory observation. Robert's writings helped me to focus my later research interests towards the role of economic ideas for political outcomes as transmitted through actual people, not rock-solid political institutions or other types of immobile formal structures. In my doctoral work on capital account liberalization in Latin America, and why it proved sustainable in one country, Peru in this case, but not in the other, Colombia, despite similar economic conditions and external challenges, I argued that specific internal cultures or identities in both countries formed during the pre-liberalization period explain the difference in the durability of capital account liberalization. Robert's writing taught me that international and domestic institutions have an inner life that needs to be taken serious and not blocked out of the analysis for the sake of making a parsimonious causal argument. There are actual people working in these institutions who constantly battle over ideas and which one should prevail in a given context. Yet the battle is not completely open-ended. Ideational and material structures constrain people's margins for action. As a result, studying the contingent interaction between agents and structures, within domestic and international institutions, became my research focus over time. Finally, a few words about Robert as a teacher. Even though I never actually took a formal course with Robert at LSE, because I was a doctoral student, I didn't do the master's at the LSE, I have been profoundly influenced by his teaching philosophy. In fact, until today, I insert the following quote in my syllabi that I first saw on one of Robert's. Quote by John Searle. "The goal of education is not to make a student feel good about herself. A good education must be guided by a permanent feeling of dissatisfaction. The dirty secret of intellectual life is that basic level work requires great amounts of effort, anxiety, and even desperation. The search for knowledge and truth, just as depth, wittiness, and originality, are not easy and surely not comfortable. A teacher's role is to challenge students out of their comfort zone, thus enabling them to think for themselves rather than regurgitating what they read or the professor said is certainly a valuable lesson that I learned from Robert." And finally, I was impressed by the way his writings were written, or his pieces, you know, the well-crafted prose, always trying to, make the point as quickly as possible and then elaborate it. It's a real pleasure, you know, and I can only recommend people to have a look at them, to follow Robert's writing in terms of also take it as an example of precision and concise writing. Thank you very much.
My turn? Okay. Well, good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Good morning. Buenos días a todos y todas. Well, thank you, Ralf, for putting this panel together. And thank you for giving me the opportunity. I think we all need to do that, I mean, one way or another, to thank the people that have influenced you. And I think this is, academic life is part of sort of receiving, of giving, of doing, and of course of saying thank you. And this is what an epistemic community is about, after all. It's about creating a circle in which people recognize each other and thank each other and fight and struggle for certain ideas, but in the end recognize each other as part of this process of receiving and giving. And I'm going to say 4 things or 4 ways in which Robert influenced my work and where I found him incredibly illuminating. The first is the very strong and very extraordinary bridge between international relations and development. The message in most of Robert's work, probably all, is that development is international. He now sits at a department that is called International Development. And at the same time, that international relations is political economy. And what I'm saying now may sound very simple, but it was not so simple at the time where I first started doing research, and that was very important when this bridge for me was very important at the time as I began doing my PhD. When development was a compact in and of itself, and was constructed as a field in and of itself, and North-South issues were part of that compact, but international relations were not part of North-South issues. International relations were about serious thinking, quote unquote. Those who shaped, it was about the countries that shape the world, not about the receivers of that shaping. So I was very uncomfortable in most of, when I did my PhD at LSE, I should say, and at the Department of International Relations. So I sat very uncomfortably in that division between international relations and development. Well, this is where I met Robert very early on, and in the mid-80s, when I was first undertaking research, of which Oscar was also part, but I was so much younger than Oscar, so I was still learning. And we were doing research at that point on conditionality, and how conditionality was designed, and who the power struggles in the World Bank that led to certain types of conditionality and not other types of conditionality, that this was a project that Stephanie Griffith-Jones was leading. And Robert Wade joined us at the cafe, joined the seminar, and this was probably when you were leaving the World Bank, or were on leave from the World Bank. This is 1988, actually, I remember it very clearly. And we were studying policy loans. These policy loans had come in very strongly in Latin America. So they were structural adjustment loans to solve, quote unquote, the debt crisis. So money was pouring in from the World Bank and, of course, the IMF as well, but very strongly from the World Bank. And in very particular issues, of course, trade liberalization. And one particular loan in 1987 was given to Argentina, which at that point was for the first time a structural adjustment loan without the IMF backing. This was a major breakthrough at the time, and in a way, and after the evolution of the loan was suspended. The World Bank loan was suspended, and I started doing research into why the World Bank loan was suspended if the conditionality had been complied with. And Robert joined the seminar and gave me, at the time, or offered to give me, and I said, of course, I want them, the confidential minutes of a World Bank discussion of that loan. You might remember the minutes, because, I mean, Pierre Bottelier was on the defense, defending why the World Bank had removed itself from the lending to Argentina. And what I learned in that, from those minutes and this offering that Robert gave me, is that research is very much, and even when you're doing political economy, research is very much about anecdotes. It's a story. How did that happen? The gossip. Gossip is evidence. The story is evidence. Why was this button pushed and not the other? What were the power struggles that led to that shape and that shape of the loan, and why did the World Bank not lend or lend to Argentina at the point? The other point in which I think I was very influenced by Robert's thinking is this agency of the international financial institutions, the capillaries of the power within the World Bank, the capillaries of how the authority and the precepts and the ideas are built, the way that the World Bank works from the inside. Not the impact of the World Bank, which is what most people do, and sometimes I do as well, but how this impact is built, is unmasking the bureaucracies, who they respond to, how does this happen? How does this loan come through? How does this waiver come through or not? What are the drivers? What are the connections? And this has very important implications for policy. And that's why it was so interesting for me, of course. The other, of course, the major influence of Robert's work is when Robert really cornered the market with the study of the developmental state, governing the market. It was, I mean, the book, Governing the Market, was renowned, of course, for unmasking the trade regime. And you might remember, Robert, we tried to bring a 50th anniversary, silver anniversary issue of the book. My paper was not published. Well, it was not approved, it did not get to be published. But reading the book 25 years later was a great pleasure. It gave me, and I was very grateful for the opportunity to read the book again, and for the way it made me think again about the connections between development and international political economy. And this is where I think Robert Wade's work has traveled and continues to travel. In that paper, that draft, I rescued 2 spin-offs of the book, which were not part of Robert's work, but influenced my own work. One is the foreign policy that a development state requires, which I started thinking of. And the second is more specifically the type of regionalism that can sustain and kindle the developmental state. What I thought when I read the book, Governing the Market Again, is that the development state does not work in isolation, which leads to the bridge that Robert makes continuously between international relations and development. I mean, the development state needs or can offer strategically guided integration, building the linkages back and forth from the region, from the global economy, to the nation, to the state, that encourage diversification and lead to regional rulemaking. Hence the importance, and this is a spin-off that I get from the book, the importance of situating the development state in a regional context, beyond the individual state. The development state intervenes in the structure of the global economy. The development state intervenes in the structure of the national economy, but it also intervenes in the structure of the regional economy and the global economy, with the resulting dynamic being co-expansion. The development state can be a major source of global change. This is the spin-off that I got, and this is maybe how it translates to what Ralf was saying, why Robert is so well read in Brazil. But this leads me to a question that I wanted to pose. And can the opposite be also true? And this leads to another piece of Robert's, China and the shrinking of development space. Can China, as a development state, instead of influence positively the regional context or the global economy, can China's growth shrink development space? So I have some questions now for Robert, maybe 3 questions using that book that was so influential. What do you think, who deserves credit for the success of the development? Thinking now 28 years later, who deserves credit for the success of the development state in the case of Taiwan? Was it the political conditions? Was it the absence of class struggle? The repression of, and the repression of the landowner interests in the case of Taiwan? 2, was it the policy regime which you unmasked, which was intervention rather than the so-called outward orientation? And 3rd, was it external support as well? How do these buttons connect to each other? And what do you think is now, or 28 years later, more important? Thank you very much.
Good morning. I want to thank Ralf and Diana for inviting me to share in this homenaje to Robert for many, many reasons. But I think the most striking one is the context in which I bumped, because that's what it was, I bumped into Governing the Market. Industrialization policies in Latin America began roughly in 1900. In 1918, Alejandro Bunge, back from Germany, started a magazine called Economía Argentina, a journal called Economía Argentina, where he started promoting industrialization policies and stating why the policy should be taken and what branches of industry should be promoted and how they should be promoted, and the uses of taxes and the uses of exchange rates, etc. This was between 1918 and 1941. He died in 43, that's right. So it was between 1918 and 41. But in the process, Alejandro Bunge had, I want to call him a nephew, but he was not properly a nephew. The godson of his brother was Raúl Prebisch. And Prebisch ended up going to some of the classes that Bunge gave at the Universidad de Buenos Aires, and at the end, after he graduated as an economist, Augusto, the brother of Alejandro Bunge, said, "Won't you hire this boy to work with you?" And he said, yes, he's a very clever man, yes, by all means. So Raúl Prebisch went to work with Alejandro Bunge at the Ministry of Labor at the Office of Statistics, where he worked for 4 years, I think it was. That is the mother of invention. The second step was that Alejandro Bunge had the idea there should be an Unión Aduanera del Sur. There should be an integration there should be a common market of the Rio de la Plata countries, and that should be an increased industrialized market. That was the idea. And he spoke about it and then promoted it actively. In 1926, he went to Chile to speak to the Rio de la Plata concept ended in Chile. I have no idea how, but that's where it ended. And he promoted it with Yáñez and Subercaseaux in Chile in 1926, after the Pan-European Conference of 1926 in Vienna. So Alejandro Bunge was a very important man in terms of industrialization, and his ideas permeated. We all had industrialization policies during the 30s because of the Depression. I mean, the best thing that ever happened to Latin America was the collapse of the commodities market. Because everybody had to say, well, now what do we do? The cotton prices were down, copper prices were down, silver prices were down, coffee prices were down, let's do something. And that's how industrialization policies came about. On top of the ideas of Alejandro Bunge, who had been writing on this for a decade. By 1930, he had been 12 years writing on the subject. So we started industrializing. Some countries more than others, Central America no, Colombia no. Peru did some stints, it tried. It had a law in 1940. The first industrialization law is from 1940 to 46. But it had some industrialization going on between 31 and 40 before the law was given. And Prebisch then, after World War II, takes on some of the results of the Bunge work. The results, the concrete results of the Bunge work were an Office of Economic Intelligence set in Buenos Aires in 1941 for an integration process of the Rio de la Plata and a free trade agreement between Uruguay and Argentina. That was the concrete result of Bunge's work. Prebisch took on that and built on that. And he builds the conference of 1950, where he speaks of the need of a South American common market, etc., everything we know, and popularizes industrialization. Those countries that had not been industrializing before entered industrialization policies in Central America and Colombia. Peru went the opposite direction. We had a very strong influence of von Mises in 1948, and we went to an export-led economy between 1948 and 1960. But we had all of those industrialization policies, and then they took on, they became more complex, and suddenly, when the rise of the interest rates in the 1981, we had a balance of payments problem, commodity prices collapsed, our balance of payments were strangled, and the diagnosis was not that interest rates had risen to a historical high, not that there was an international financial problem going on. The diagnosis was industrialization policies. And I thought, this is strange. Why are they looking at industrialization policy if this is a financial stuff? My master's degree is in international finance from the London Business School. So I know it's a financial problem. It's not a structural, productive problem. It's financial. But and then we had the 80s, and we had the policies, taking down wages and contracting wages. And with wages contracted in some countries down to 3/4. So if we had 100 in 1980, you had 25% in 1990. And we exported roughly, as we all know, 1/3 of our GDP. Now that's a depression. However way you want to call it, that is an economic depression. But no. The insistence was, the problem is, you have an industrial base that is nonsense. And of course, there is Hirschman's article on industrialization and its discontents. There was a problem with the industrialization process. But that problem had to be worked out. It did not need to be destroyed. In that context, this is, I call it the Dark Ages, we had hyperinflation or very high inflation all over Latin America. GDP was contracting very quickly, wages were going down very fast, and the IMF was more or less ruling the region with very heavy political costs all over. And then suddenly comes out a book that says, wait a minute, the East Asia is not a result of free market policies, as a previous article by Mint had said. No, East Asia is a result of state-led industrialization policies. And I said, oh my God, who is this man? I started reading the book with so much interest and wondering why we had been told that our problem was the industrialization policies, because that's when I got uncomfortable. All along the 1980s, when we had the discussions in 1980, whatever it was, 7, she was in a tricycle and I was in a bicycle. And we were discussing the debt problems, and Peru did not have any adjustment policies of the World Bank. We had the 10% of the debt as a top payment policy, so we did not have any relationship with the World Bank or the IMF. There was no adjustment. But we were discussing what was going on with industries, and imagine, in the middle of this, Peru opened up in 1990. The World Bank came on over with Fujimori, opened up the economy. There was a coup d'etat in 1992, led by Fujimori. And the day after the coup, April the 6th, 1992, 700 decrees were passed with all of the economic reforms the World Bank wanted. April the 6th. That's not, you know. A military coup in Chile for economic reforms. A military coup in Argentina for economic reforms. A military coup in Uruguay for economic reforms. And a military coup in Peru for economic reforms. Who is making the military coups? They are. I landed in Norway. I was a critical of the coup, and I landed in Norway for a long time. And in Norway comes out the book Governing the Market, saying, yes, the state is the one that did Southeast Asia. But then reading what he was writing in the New Left Review at the time on the World Bank and the IMF, I thought, how interesting. So this is the politics of this. What's really lying behind what's happening to us is happening in the relationship between IFIs, the US government, and the dynamics of academia and the US government and the IFIs. How interesting. It opened a world. It opened the world. I said, well, so maybe we haven't lost all hope. That's what I thought. Maybe we haven't lost all hope. And I started researching as a result of that reading, Governing the Market, I started researching on something that landed being called The False Dilemma, a book published by Z Books in 2000, published in Caracas in 1997 by whomever it was, Nueva Sociedad. But that's why I wrote the book, because I was pushed. It was like, you know, we are thrown into a dilemma of export, whatever it is, or die, and it's the market that does it, and that's a false dilemma. It's not true. What's true is that you still need a strong government that puts the las metas of where we're going to go and how we're going to get there. And it was such a relief. I was in Norway thinking, my God, you know, we could have saved ourselves so much trouble if we had read this in 1980. But of course, in 1980 it was not written. But it was, the other thing that surprised me, but that has surprised me later, is Robert's preoccupation on income, poverty and income distribution as a result of the policies. And, you know, it's one of these things that drink Coca-Cola, you see the advert, drink Coca-Cola, drink Coca-Cola, drink Coca-Cola. You drink Coca-Cola. You don't even think about where it was that you saw the advert of drink Coca-Cola. You just do it instantly. This pushing the subject that when you're doing the free trade policies, what you get are poverty problems and income concentration problems. And if you don't do something from the government, they get worse. Pushing on that. So I began thinking automatically, but of course, every time you do, you adjust, this is what's going to happen. And I have produced a book without quoting Robert at all, called the Historia Crítica del Fondo Monetario, that came out, the third edition, in Buenos Aires last year, or 2 years ago, whenever. And where I do this, I say this automatically. And now rereading, I said, but this is where the idea came from. My God, I should have put the bloody quote. It's like, you know, drink Coca-Cola. It was automatic. I mean, this is what happened. Of course, this is what happened. Nobody said it. It's automatic. But no, he said it. So Robert's work for Latin America is very important. Unfortunately, and this is where I separate Brazil from Latin America, like Leslie Bethel does, unfortunately, by the time Robert's book came out, I would say the Mexican consensus was, it was 93 by the time, no, it was 90 when the book came out. It was the time when in Mexico, Salinas de Gortari had agreed with Bush father to do NAFTA. And the general academic consensus was the best policy is no industrial policy, which is something that this Gary Becker's quote that Robert quotes frequently is what Salinas de Gortari quoted several times. So the book was not translated in 1990. The book came out in 1999, 10 years later. And it could have easily come out in 91 in a different context. But in that context, it came out in 99, and I am sure what happened to him is what happened to my book. There was one edition that got hidden somewhere, so everybody knows it in one language but not in the other. Because I have never seen the book in Spanish, ever. And when I was looking in the internet to reread, I saw there was the book in Spanish, and I thought, oh, I didn't know this existed. That's funny. I don't know. So that's the unfortunate part. So, so Robert, as a result of that, is more read, I think, in Brazil than on the Spanish-speaking countries. But the ones of us who have read him on this side of the world, I think have been very much inspired and struck by his work. So for all of that and a whole lot of other things, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for the interventions, and then we'd like to have Robert to respond.
Okay, well, I have to tell you, this is an out-of-body experience. Out-of-body experience. It's a bit like, it reminds me of a band which releases a greatest hits album well before the end of the life expectancy of that band.
They always have a final farewell tour, and then there's a farewell tour after.
Yes. But it is an out-of-body experience in another way as well, because on Sunday last, at this time, almost to the minute, I was in Istanbul preparing to jump into the water and swim the longest swim I have ever swum in my life, which is a 6.5-kilometer race from Asia to Europe in the Bosphorus. And to my complete astonishment, because I was doubtful when I started that I would even be able to finish this 6.5-kilometer race, I not only finished, but I came second in my age category. And so I was completely jubilant. And now, only a few days later, here I am, not Istanbul, but in Quito, Ecuador, being the subject of all this praise. And I have to say, it's very gratifying to see that these ideas have come forward into the present. But it's also, and it's also flattering, and it's also embarrassing. So what I want to do is just spend a little bit of time explaining some of the background to the argument that I made in Governing the Market. And the first point I have to make is to slightly correct something that Ralf said, which is that my training is in anthropology. Actually, what happened was that I trained as an economist in New Zealand, undergraduate majoring in economics, and then I did an honors degree in economics. And I planned to come to the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex in order to study development economics. But on the way there, I spent some weeks in India and also in Greece, and it didn't take long in those countries for me to decide that what I understood then by economics was both boring and also very difficult to relate to what I was seeing with my eyes. Like in India, there seemed to be all this very active activity going on at village level, and yet somehow or other this was not yielding what you might have thought. It was not yielding economic development, it was yielding a great deal of extreme poverty. And so when I arrived at Sussex, I went to the anthropology department. I had never studied anthropology before, and I announced that I wished to do a PhD in anthropology rather than in economics. And so basically that is what happens. And from the time that I spent not just in India and Greece en route, but also previously, I had spent some time in Malaysia and in Sri Lanka, because my father was a New Zealand diplomat and he had been posted in those two countries. Out of that experience, I began really quite early on to take as a kind of central interest the Adam Smith question about the wealth of nations, namely why there are these enormous disparities in the material well-being of people in different countries around the world. And that sort of Adam Smith question has remained really central to my interests, even as I do things like study how the US and the Europeans, the Part 1 countries, managed to manipulate the World Bank reform of 2010 to make it look like there was a transfer of votes from the Part 1 countries, that is the advanced countries, to the Part 2 countries, the developing countries, of 4.6%. percentage points, rather, 4.6 percentage points, when in reality, if you really drilled down, you discovered that the actual transfer was 0.46%. So, I mean, that seems a long way from the kind of Adam Smith question, but actually everything that I've done has taken the Adam Smith question as its sort of center of gravity. But what happened was this. I went to Sussex. I announced I wished to study anthropology. I wanted to go and do a PhD in India. But at Sussex they said there's no money for India, but there is money for studies of European peasantry. So to cut a long story short, I went to Italy because I had learned about the Italian land reform, which was the biggest non-communist land reform that had ever been carried out. This is in the late 1940s and well into the 1950s. And probably today, the Italian land reform, although nobody knows about it, remains the biggest non-communist land reform ever carried out in terms of the expenditure per hectare and expenditure per farm family. The problem was that when I got to my area, which was in the middle of a big land reform zone, by that time the Italian miracle had taken place, and suddenly the problem was no longer how to get land, enough land for the people, on which the Communist Party was making great support. The problem was no longer how to get enough land for the people, but how to get enough people for the land, because people were flooding out of the Italian countryside into the northern cities, thanks to the Italian industrialization that really took off in the early 1960s. And so when I went to my area and tried to talk to people about the Italian land reform, they kind of reacted as though I was trying to talk to them about ancient Rome. In other words, that was a distant event that was of no relevance for today. But so I ended up doing a PhD on what could be called social capital in this area, but unfortunately I did not think to coin the phrase social capital. If I had, I would be, well, where would I be at? I would be at Harvard, probably. In any case, then I went on, having finished the PhD, I went on to India. And initially to do a study of land reform in India, but it became clear to me early on that there was just no possible prospect of land reform in India. And so I thought, well, if not land reform, what about water reform? Because I knew that these great big public irrigation canals were being operated and maintained in a way that made farmers very uncertain of when water would come, and therefore they invested relatively little in inputs to agriculture. Therefore, the productivity of irrigated agriculture, at least from canals, was very low. And that was dragging back India's economic growth much more generally. And so I did a study of the Indian irrigation bureaucracy that was running these giant canals. And at the same time, I did a study of how villages underneath the canals in one area were organizing themselves to use the irrigation water and handle other common property problems. And that second part led to the book called Village Republics. But my interest was really caught by the study of the bureaucracy, these state-level bureaucracies that were allocating a resource that at times of the year was more valuable than gold. And to my complete surprise, after I'd been in this area, living in this area for maybe 6 months, this is the anthropology. So I was not an economist flying in and looking at statistics and talking to government officials. I was living in villages and small towns. To my complete surprise, I began to unearth a very elaborate, well-institutionalized corruption system, whereby the incentives on the irrigation engineers were to do the opposite of what they were meant to be doing. That is, they were meant to be reducing farmers' uncertainty about when the water would come and how much water. Their incentive was to increase farmers' uncertainty about the water supply, because then groups of farmers would come and offer them money to shift the uncertainty somewhere else. So the engineers could multiply their annual salary 20, 30, 40 times through this corruption system, which was well organized, but it was also secret. That is to say, the engineers knew this was not something that outsiders should know about. And at a certain point, I began to feel a bit worried about my own safety as I unraveled this and as the engineers began to know what I was finding out and threatened the farmers that they would cut off the farmers' water supply if they saw the farmers talking to me. And then the next step was that I was invited by K.N. Raj, a celebrated Indian economist, to do, who was working for the ILO, to do a comparison between how the Indians were organizing their big irrigation canals and how the East Asians, like Taiwanese, South Koreans, were organizing their irrigation canals. So it's a bureaucracy serving the same functions, but in two very different regions. And for one reason or another, I chose South Korea rather than Taiwan. And so I went to do this comparison between Indian irrigation organization and South Korean. And in the course of that, I became absolutely fascinated by the South Korean bureaucracy as compared with the Indian, because as I said, the Indian bureaucracy had no incentives on anybody to do anything except the corruption incentives, because promotions and so on were all just sort of automatic. You got promoted automatically. The South Korean counterpart was full of incentives, both individual incentives and collective incentives, for people to do a good job and to keep getting training. Just as one example of this, in the South Korean bureaucracy, every person has a promotion score, a numerical promotion score, and there's a formula for calculating the promotion score. And one of the main ways by which you can increase your score and therefore your chances of promotion is to go on training courses, which are carried out by a national training college for government officials in different sectors, and not just go on the course, but get a high percentage mark in the final exam, because that percentage mark is what is put into your promotion formula. So that's an individual promotion formula, but there were also various forms of, there were collective incentives as well on groups of officials competing with other groups of officials in the same bureaucracy, which I won't go into now. And so I was really intrigued by this comparison between India and South Korea. And then back at IDS, Sussex, Gordon White, a China expert, and I began talking of having a sort of a broader regional East Asia project of research. And we got funding for what we called the East Asia Project, which ran roughly from 1983 to 1988. And so I went off to Taiwan in 1983 to do that research. And by this time, I was beginning to be aware of how strong was the neoliberal revolution in economics. And in particular, because I was reading papers about Taiwan, Korea, by leading neoclassicals like Ian Little, like Hala Mint, like Gus Reynes, like Eric Thorbecke, like Deepak Lal. And they were all saying that these countries are the big success stories to be emulated by others because of market liberalization. They liberalized their markets. They're moving towards free trade, for example, is what was said. And I began to be really intrigued at the disjunction between what this literature was saying and what I was learning and had learned earlier in South Korea about a very different kind of development strategy, a very different kind of state, and state role as compared with what this great bulk of the literature was saying. And so I did this fieldwork in 1983, and then curiously enough, out of the blue, I got an invitation from the World Bank to come and work on something quite different, which was back to irrigation bureaucracy. The World Bank wanted an international comparison of irrigation bureaucracies. And so I agreed to go to the World Bank, not because I was actually interested in doing that piece of research, but because, as Ralf indicated, I was interested in getting into the World Bank and finding out how it could possibly be that these World Bank people were presenting a picture of East Asia, of the East Asian strategy. Actually, the right phrase is not presenting a picture. The right phrase is presenting a story, because that's what they were doing. They were presenting a story, and they were being very selective with their evidence in order to present only evidence which was consistent with the story about market liberalization as the secret of success. That's what I wanted to find out, how it was that these people were managing to do this. And so I had a very strange existence. By day, on the working week, I was rather unenthusiastically proceeding with this study of the international comparison of irrigation bureaucracies. But in the evening and at weekends, I was working on this book, which became Governing the Market. And I think it's very striking that this same disjunction has continued really to this day. That is to say, amongst the economists that I know at LSE, including about 6 now in my Department of International Development, they know nothing about the developmental state. They couldn't care less about the developmental state. They haven't read anything. They certainly haven't read my book, but none of the other stuff. And they're not interested in finding out. So there's this disjunction that I encountered back in 1984 continues, I think, to this day. At this time, the World Bank was really in the grip of a neoliberal regime. Anne Kruger had come in as the chief economist, and she had brought in as her henchman Deepak Lal. And Deepak Lal, who dresses in extremely elegant 3-piece suits and speaks with an Oxford accent, more Oxbridge than Oxford, is, if you excuse the phrase, a very vicious person in making sure that only one line prevails. And he just went around being very brutal and basically firing people who were not following the Anne Kruger kind of line. But they got rumors about me, but I wasn't working on the subjects that Anne Kruger was so concerned about. I was apparently working on the international comparison of irrigation bureaucracies. But then I moved in a big bank reorganization to the trade policy division of the World Bank to work on how East Asian countries were promoting exports. And I said to my division chief, Vinod Thomas, who went on to have a very successful career in the bank, I said to him, I'm fine, I will write studies of how Korea, Taiwan, Japan also promoted exports, but I have to talk also about how they did import replacement. And Vinod and the others in the department, in the division said, oh, no, you can't talk about import replacement. And I said, I must talk about import replacement because these two processes were tightly integrated. I used the metaphor, they were the two wings of the same bird. And Vinod said, no, only exports. And it got really to the point of a real deterioration in our interpersonal relationship, such that, for example, he and I might be going down a corridor from opposite directions, and he would see me approaching, and he would suddenly turn around and run back to go into the men's toilet until I had gone past. He didn't want any kind of contact because I was threatening his career. And I'm not making a joke. He saw me as a threat to his career. If I went ahead and talked about import replacement in the World Bank in a positive rather than a negative way, that would hinder his career. And as I said, he went on to have a very successful career, not least because I left the World Bank with no record of all the research that I'd done, and I went to work for the US Congress's Office of Technology Assessment, which was then carrying out a big study of how East Asia got successful, and they were dead keen to hear about all the industrial policy that was being used, because the Office of Technology Assessment was more than favorable to the US having an industrial policy. Needless to say, the Republicans later closed it down for having these ideas, but at that time they were more than open to the kind of arguments that I was making. And so I went on to have a very happy year at the Office of Technology Assessment. So all this then became background to, and that was, by the way, in 1988-89. And then came the World Bank's East Asia Miracle Report, published in 1993. And I knew both Nancy Birdsall and John Page, who were the top people at the World Bank, very well. And so I was really, really intrigued as to know how they were going to handle this, because it didn't take long to find out about the basic conflict that they were exposed to, namely that the Japanese Ministry of Finance had put $1.2 million on the table to make the World Bank undertake a study of East Asia's development. The World Bank did not want to do the study. It had always just studied individual countries on their own, never done a regional study, did not want to do it. But the Japanese were by then the number 2 shareholder at the World Bank, number 2, and they put 1.2 million on the table. And so the bank could not say, well, thank you, but no thank you. The bank had to do it. So they appointed John Page and Nancy Birdsall. And Nancy and John knew very well that the one thing that the Japanese Ministry of Finance most wanted the bank to say was that concessional lending, that is targeted credit, targeted at particular sectors, had been effective in East Asia, not just in Japan, but in Korea and Taiwan, and could be effective in Southeast Asia. Why? Because the World Bank had earlier been very, very critical of the Japanese Ministry of Finance for having concessional credit schemes as part of its aid programs in Southeast Asia. And the bank sent very, very critical letters to them saying, to the Japanese ministry, saying that you are practicing financial repression, and that word means, repression means it must be a bad thing. It's distorting the distribution of resources, and you must stop. You are messing up their whole development and messing up our programs in Southeast Asia. You must stop. The Japanese Ministry of Finance got really upset, in particular because the Japanese Ministry of Finance thought that its own most important contribution to Japan's success after the Second World War was directed credit, and it was very aggrieved that Chalmers Johnson and other people said that the key to Japan's success was MITI, not the Ministry of Finance, but MITI. And the Ministry of Finance said, no, we were as important as MITI because we had all this directed credit, and it worked. So the Ministry of Finance had a big investment in getting the World Bank to say that directed credit could sometimes work. And yet the World Bank at that time was saying directed credit and other price distortions can never work. And so how were John and Nancy going to handle this? Well, if you read the report, it is a masterpiece in confusion, a masterpiece of inconsistency, because they had to say that it works, directed credit, but they had to say also that it doesn't work and that industrial policy generally doesn't work.
It works.
And so what they did was they said, first of all, remember these were World Bank officials and their career was at stake according to how they maneuvered through this. And so what they said was that the key to East Asia's economic success, and this is a quote, was neutral incentives in international trade. Neutral incentives in international trade. that is the phrase they use. That is the key to East Asia's economic success. But in the preface, and that's the point, in the preface, they say something different. They say that directed credit can, in certain circumstances, work. And the reason is that the preface was written by Lewis Preston, who is the president. And John and Nancy, of course, Preston didn't write it. They wrote it, and he signed it. But the key point is that because it was his preface, it did not have to go up through the bank approval process, whereas all the rest of the document had to come up through the bank approval process, where it was all reined back into this idea that the key to East economic success was neutral incentives in international trade. So the Japanese got the statement that they paid $1.2 million for in the preface signed by the president, but the whole of the rest of the book really runs against what is said in the preface. So I became really fascinated by this as a story, as the construction of as an attempt to construct a story that would satisfy somehow or other both of these sides. And so I began to do research on how this had happened inside the bank. This is what I call, and I've done a lot of this in other contexts, this is what I like to call underwear politics, or the politics of the underwear. This is what the visiting economists who fly in and fly out never see, but this is the kind of thing that you were talking about. And I remember vividly a seminar in Tokyo after the report was published, organized by the Ministry of Finance, where a very senior World Bank official announced to this big gathering that the World Bank would not be doing any more research on East Asia. The World Bank now understood the secret of East Asia's success, which was neutral incentives. And the World Bank's task now was to apply these lessons in Africa and in Latin America. And so that's the way the bank tried to shut the whole thing, this apparent threat to the integrity of this neoliberal story that the bank was very committed to. That's how the bank tried to shut down and avoid any kind of more serious engagement. And then, of course, something dramatic happened, which was, when was this, in 2008, Justin Lin, the Chinese, was appointed chief economist of the World Bank. And Justin has some sympathy with industrial policy, but a very, let's say, a very qualified sympathy. He keeps saying in everything he writes that the industries, the activities that are targeted for special help must be within the economy's existing comparative advantage. And this is the phrase he keeps saying again and again and again. And I think one reason he keeps saying this is because if he keeps saying that, then he does not cause all his mainstream economists to simply shut their eyes and close their ears. Because if he's saying comparative advantage, yes, keep within that specialization, then he cannot be all bad. Or at least I presume that was his calculation, but I've talked to Justin at some length, and he is the first to say that less than 10% of World Bank economists agreed with even his very cautious idea of industrial policy. And as soon as Justin left in 2012, the woman, a Latin American actually, I think she was Chilean, who took over the director position within the vice presidency of the chief economist, the woman who became director of the key department which could have taken forward Justin Lin's ideas, announced almost on her first day in post that she knows all about Latin American industrial policy, she knows it doesn't work, and therefore the World Bank was not going to do anything more on industrial policy. And so in this whole context, I get quite annoyed at people like Danny Roderick, who announce, quote, "No one really believes the Washington Consensus anymore," unquote. When he says that, he means no one up on the frontiers writing in the journals would take the simple Washington Consensus at face value. But the point is lower down, so to speak, off the frontiers, at the operational levels of the World Bank, the IMF, and these other Western-run organizations, these basic neoliberal ideas, this basic neoliberal story, remains very powerful, though now it has been added to by the good governance agenda and a kind of neoliberal view of what constitutes good governance has been grafted on to the older Washington Consensus ideas, which were just about price incentives, getting the price incentives right. And so back to the point that I was making earlier, just to finish, there is a real disjunction between what the great economics mainstream continues to say about economic development and the stream of literature about the developmental state. And the question is what to do about that. But just finally, I will remind you of at least two very, I think, very fine recent books about the developmental state. One of them is by Elizabeth Thurbon, who's at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, called Developmental Mindset, and this is particularly about South Korea. It's a very fine piece of work. And this is the book by Steph Haggard, which has just been published. Very short and very succinct book, giving an analytical account of the whole developmental state literature. These are terrific books. I strongly recommend them. But I also have to say that if you're looking for much about the underwear politics of the developmental state, you won't find very much of that in these books. These books pride themselves on being analytical, and therefore they don't talk much about the gossip. And I think you're quite right that the gossip should be taken seriously. Gossip can be really important. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert.